Morning to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am Arunabha Ghosh. I'm the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, one of the world's leading climate think tanks. We are based in New Delhi, but we work on climate and sustainability matters across India and in other emerging markets as well. I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Ananta Aspen Center for this new series of webinars called Between a Rock and a Hard Place, which will address the harsh reality of trying to battle between two existential crises at the very same time. In other words, how do we deal with what are called wicked problems? Today, we are here for the inaugural session, which starts with talking about climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Consider this, and this comes from the International Monetary Fund. Under the assumption that the pandemic and required containment peaks continue into the second quarter for most countries in the world, we presume that there is going to be a downgrade of 6.3 percentage points against what the IMF had predicted for global growth in January 2020. Effectively, we are looking at a global growth rate, a global economic growth rate of -3% this year. This makes this so-called Great Lockdown the worst recession since the Great Depression, far worse than what we faced with the global financial crisis a little over a decade ago. But consider also this. The lockdown, which has been across the world and across all major economies, will result, by some estimates, to reduce emissions by 5.5% in this year. CO2 emissions will fall by the sharpest decline ever recorded. And yet, this fall would be short of the 7.6 percentage points decrease in emissions that is needed year on year to keep temperature rise to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. So here we are faced with two conundrums. On one hand, we have a severe economic crisis, one that we've not seen in 3 generations. On the other hand, we have a severe climate crisis, which will keep worsening because climate change has not just tail-end risks, but non-linear tail-end risks, which means that the risks will keep rising with time, and that what are low probability events now are likely to have, if they come about, will have devastating impacts across the world. This is exactly what we are witnessing with the pandemic. It will be a far worse situation when a series of perfect storm shocks begins to hit us thanks to climate change. So what are our conundrums? At a national level, would there be a shrinking appetite to act on anything which would be considered sustainable or climate friendly when governments would have a priority to, in fact, kickstart the economy? We're, in fact, having this conversation just 2 days after the Prime Minister in India announced a massive recovery package amounting to about 10% of the GDP of the country. At an international level, if this global shutdown is not enough to keep emissions to the required limits, what more would need to be done? Indeed, when we think about this rock and a hard place metaphor, I often wonder, why don't we actually ask ourselves what is between the rock and the hard place? Is there a soft landing ground? Is there any common ground? Is there a valley with an array of solar panels? Is there a gigafactory for batteries? Between the rock and a hard place lies opportunity. And I am delighted that we can engage on this particular subject with 2 stellar, eminent speakers from 2 very different fields. So let me introduce our speakers today, and then I will turn over to them to illuminate us with their thoughts on these 2 big conundrums. We have with us Mr. Jamshyd Godrej, who's the chairman of the Ananta Center and the chairman of the board of the Godrej and Boyce Manufacturing Company. He has a very long history of supporting environmental sustainability in India and abroad. He's the president of the Worldwide Fund for Nature in India, the chairperson of the board of directors of the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, the India Resources Trust, and my own institution, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. He's also the chairman of the CII Sorabji Godrej Green Business Center, is a director of the World Resources Institute in the United States, and a trustee of the Asia Society. In the past, he has served as the president of the Confederation of Indian Industry and of the Indian Machine Tool Manufacturers Association. Mr. Godrej graduated in mechanical engineering from Illinois Institute of Technology in the United States, is an ardent yachting enthusiast, and has done extensive yachting and cruising across the west coast of India, the Baltic and the North Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Mediterranean Sea. We'll see how Mr. Godrej handles sea level rise during this conversation. In 2003, the President of India conferred on Mr. Godrej one of our highest civilian honors, the Padma Bhushan. We also have with us Professor Colin Price. He's a professor in the Porter School of Environment and Earth Sciences and the head of the Department of Environmental Studies at Tel Aviv University. He's an atmospheric physicist specializing in the Earth's weather and climate, with a focus on thunderstorms, climate change, and natural hazards. I'd love to hear from Professor Price what he has to say about extreme weather events and the related risks for rich and poor countries alike. Professor Price's research focuses on using atmospheric electricity to study natural hazards such as flash floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and solar storms. He completed his BSc and MSc degrees in geophysics and atmospheric sciences from Tel Aviv University and got his PhD from Columbia University in New York. After working at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies and completing a postdoctoral fellowship at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California, he returned to Israel to join the faculty of Tel Aviv University in 1995. He's published more than 140 scientific papers and heads the Institute on Innovation in Transportation and the Institute on Nanosatellites, which are both at Tel Aviv University. Thank you again for joining me for this conversation today. I'm now going to request Mr. Godrej to kick us off. Mr. Godrej, we are faced with two conundrums, an economic crisis and a climate crisis. Can you find us a way out of this rock and a hard place?
Thank you, Arunabha, and thank you for all our participants and my co-moderator, co-panelist here. You know, the challenge for India, especially, has been economic development for the last many, many decades. I think when we look at India's development, we only look at the top line growth of India, which is the GDP growth. But that really does hide a lot of things that have happened in India over the last many decades. I think India, despite having very ambitious targets on things like renewable energy, we have not been able to actually reduce emissions in any significant way. So on the one hand, we have this high economic development that we are pursuing, sometimes sustainably, sometimes unsustainably. But actually, it has really hid a lot of the problems that have been there. And today, many of these stand exposed. I think Arunabha clearly indicated the fact that emissions have dropped very significantly. Of course, anecdotally, you see pictures of clean skies, blue skies, being able to see at long distances, if people are able to breathe better, all of that. But the point really is that it has only proved that our way of economic activity has actually, gone in a way that has resulted in a lot of air pollution, a lot of issues to do with water. Forest covers have come down. We have huge population problems. So we must remember that, when something like COVID-19 takes place and it starts to expose the sort of weaknesses that we have in our system and throws it up, we have to remember that it is really about man-made climate change and not about any other natural systems or cycles, etc. And my feeling is that this sort of long, many weeks of shutdown is going to make people think clearly about what is it that we should be looking at from an economic development perspective. How do we do it in a much more sustainable way? Also, I think from a global perspective, yes, this pandemic will certainly slow down global trade, global economic development. I think it's even making the oil-rich nations to think about, why is it that they are in oil and why is it that they cannot be in something else like solar, etc. And I think we will see, as a result of this, a lot of changes taking place. So we should look at this from the opportunity that it presents to us to improve our approach to climate change, our approach to economic development. It has to be more inclusive. It has to be one which will result in the type of things that we are seeing today as a result of the shutdown. But of course, economic development is essential. And it is essential because that's the only way that you're going to get the 300 or 500 million people in India who live at the edge of poverty to really be part of India's development story. So I will close with these remarks at this stage. Thank you, Arunabha.
Thank you, Mr. Godrej, for outlining that the crisis of climate change is not just about carbon in the atmosphere. It's also very closely linked to air quality. It's linked to our water systems, our forest cover, and that's why the new economic pathway that we have to chart isn't just about the arithmetic between GDP and carbon, but a much more holistic set of metrics that we have to measure progress against. Professor Price, let me now turn to you. Sitting where you are at, how do you see this conundrum shaping up between the imperative of economic growth coming out of this crisis, but also maintaining and rather increasing the momentum of action on climate change?
Well, thank you also for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I'm very happy to be here. And I think we really need to have more of these discussions because we're at some kind of a junction where we really have to decide which road we're going to take in the next decade. I think the key word I'm hearing from everyone is opportunity. I think there's a lot of opportunity here and there's an opportunity to learn. And that's the first thing. I think the first thing we can learn from the present crisis is that if you wait until you see there's a problem, then it's going to be too late to stop it. If we look at the different responses from different countries around the world, those who acted right out off the bat, Taiwan, South Korea, some other countries compared with Italy, Spain, the US, dramatic differences in the number of people which got sick, which are dying, the hospitals which are overwhelmed, the health system in certain countries. And this is very similar with climate change. We can learn from this that if you act quickly, you can actually reduce the damages in the long term. And as I think Benjamin Franklin said a few hundred years ago, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We know that if we invest now in preventing climate change in the future, we'll save lots of money. If we wait until we see things happening, it's going to be too late. And a good example there is next door to India, next door to Israel, if we're talking about sea level rise, and 1 meter of sea level rise will result in about 16 million refugees from Bangladesh and about 6 million refugees from Egypt because of rising sea level. We're going to have to deal with these, and the costs are going to be dramatically more to deal with these problems later than to prevent them at this stage. Another thing which we can learn, which is actually, I don't think anyone would have believed that the world can work together on such a crisis. Within 2 months, within less than 2 months, the world shut down because of a little virus that we can't see. But basically, everyone's working together and we're sacrificing, everyone's staying at home, working from home for the good of the long term. We need to do the same with climate change. The climate change problem and crisis is going to be orders of magnitude larger. We need to actually sacrifice today in order to make things better for the future generations down the road. And that brings me to the governments, which we see also that although we need to have behavioral change, each one has to change the ways that we're traveling, our diets, etc. But who would have believed that whole countries would be locked down in India and Israel, the rest of the world, and we wouldn't be going outside for 2 months? Governments are the only ones who can do this. People won't voluntarily do this, and the same with climate change. We need to have leadership, world leadership, which unfortunately we don't have at the moment. But if we have some good leadership, we need to actually change our ways dramatically. And that leads to my last point related to opportunity, that we've got millions of people unemployed today, companies going bankrupt. We have now an opportunity to make the shift. We've been talking about shifting to alternative energy, renewable energies. We're very far from that, but now we have a huge workforce who's looking for jobs. Now let's take this opportunity and change our direction away from fossil fuels to more clean, renewable energy sources. So I'll stop there, I think, for the moment.
Thank you, Professor Price, for outlining the opportunity that lies despite the humanitarian crisis that we face, but also outlining the even bigger threats that we are likely going to face thanks to climate change, whether it's sea level rise as a first order impact or distressed migration as a second order impact. I often argue when I talk about climate risks, it matters, of course, what we are doing to the planet, and matters, of course, what the planet does to us, but it matters the most what we do to each other. And the resilience of our communities and our governance systems are going to be tested. So before I switch to some questions for both of you, let me also invite the audience to start posting their questions. This panel is right now being broadcast via Facebook Live as well. So you can send in your comments there, or you can put in the comments on the Zoom platform in the Q&A box. As they keep popping up, I'm going to ask our speakers a few more questions through this conversation, and then I'm going to try and draw in some of the questions that come in from those who are listening in. So let me turn to you again, Mr. Godrej. You said that there is now an imperative that the opportunity that is before us for economic recovery also has to be inclusive. Now, one of the arguments that those who say that climate change or action on climate change is very expensive, one of the arguments they present is that it might violate against so-called inclusive growth because it might hit the costs of taking these climate actions when you are in an economic recession will be even more felt by the poor. So what is the counter narrative to that kind of a proposition? How do we make it both a sustainable economic recovery, but also an inclusive economic recovery?
Yeah, Arunabha, that's a really important question. And, very often when we talk of the cost of doing things in a sustainable way versus the cost of doing it in an unsustainable way, all the costs involved in doing things in an unsustainable way are not considered. I mean, if you take, for instance, coal-fired power plants, this is not something new that I'm mentioning, but it is well known that the air quality associated with coal-fired power plants is a huge health hazard. Now, how much does that health hazard actually cost a nation? How much does it cost an individual or a family, especially children and elderlies? I mean, these costs are not factored in when you say, okay, power from coal costs so much, but power from solar costs so much. Both have major disabilities. Okay, one, we know with coal, if it's not done in a really, really clean way, it can have huge costs on society. The same thing even with solar. We know today that without storage, we're not going to have 24/7 power from solar. But costs are coming down very, very significantly because of innovation, because of new developments. I mean, a simple thing, for instance, like solar cells always had only one surface, which was facing the sun. Today, solar cells have two surfaces, both facing the sun and a reflection from the roof on which they're put. Once you paint that roof with a reflective material or a white paint or something like that, you can actually, get a huge bump up of 20, 30, 40%, depending on, which part of the day and which part of the world you're in. So I think innovation will make that difference to bring this inclusive growth, with climate action to a point where it is really, in every respect, is less expensive and more inclusive. And power is not the only thing. I think we have to understand that there are so many other things that are involved in from a climate perspective. Okay, I mentioned water earlier. Right. We know that, if we do not, have clean water, the health associated, the health risks and problems associated with lack of clean water are well known. So I think, we must understand the total cost of doing things in a sustainable way versus an unsustainable way. Yes, there can be debates about cost and, who incurs them, and whether it's at the society level, it's at an individual level, who actually pays these costs at the end of the day. And so I think this is an important aspect to consider.
So, Mr. Godrej, I have a follow-up question, and I'm going to come to technology development in a second, but my follow-up question is about how do we internalize these costs that are being imposed on society, right? We are also in a situation right now where governments across the world are going to be struggling to find money to finance the stimulus that their economies need. The US is looking at $3 trillion. We are looking at $260 billion. Regardless, no government, even if it can print money, has a bottomless treasure chest. Is this an opportunity to impose a carbon tax, which brings in government revenue, and if it is deployed appropriately, can also kind of help weather some of the shocks that the poorer communities face? So in the US, this conversation has been about a tax and rebate. Is this an opportunity for a new fiscal instrument?
Well, I certainly do agree with you that having a carbon tax can be beneficial enormously. And this is something that we should consider all the aspects of a carbon tax. There are always two sides to any of these debates, whether it's to do with the carbon tax or otherwise. What does it do? Will it really change behavior? Will the money that the government collects on the carbon tax be used specifically for the right things, which is to enhance the sustainability aspect? For instance, and the reason why there are doubts is because when the small tax was put on coal, imported coal and domestic coal, it was ostensibly, to promote innovation, to promote research, to do more on sustainability, etc. But actually, very little of that has happened. So I think, you will also then need the mechanisms of transparency, mechanisms to be able to inform us, of where that money has been spent, how it's been spent. So the debate should be, in an open forum, really, in that sense, for it to work. Because if it's not in that open forum, I think even good ideas like a carbon tax can fail.
Professor Price, let me turn to you and just pick up on what Mr. Godrej was saying and connect it to something that you mentioned earlier, that we have to sacrifice today to make sure that we have a more sustainable future. Indeed, we are all sacrificing today. We are under lockdown. Our businesses, our large and small businesses, are under strain. And we've managed to do that, as you rightly pointed out, very quickly in response to a microscopic virus. So if on one side, as Mr. Godrej was arguing, that we need to figure out a way to internalize the externalities, to use some jargon. The question to you is, what will nudge behavior? What will make us agree that sacrificing today is the better move? Even if it sounds rational, individually we might free ride on other people sacrificing. So if the carbon tax or a price were not there, what other moves could be used to nudge our sacrifice?
Good question. So I think one of the key aspects is to describe climate change as a health issue similar to the Corona crisis. People don't normally talk about climate change as being a health issue, but it's an extreme health issue. Not only air pollution, but when we have heat waves, when we have tropical storms, fires, air pollution, there's so many issues related to human health. And when people talk about the health, as we are with the coronavirus, people take action. When people see people are dying on the streets, hospitals are overwhelmed, that means something to them. When we're talking about rising sea level or changing carbon dioxide, even the title climate change or global warming sounds positive to some people. Warming, it's getting nice and warm. What's wrong? Instead of calling it the climate crisis or the climate emergency. So I think the first thing is really to make this a big health issue. This climate change, similar to Corona, is a health issue. The second thing is to somehow to make it personal. The reason why people have acted with the coronavirus is because, first of all, it's an immediate threat to people, but it's also a personal threat. They can see people dying in their neighborhoods. Their grandparents are at risk, so they'll stay at home. Climate change is kind of a slow threat, and often people think it's impersonal. It's going to affect someone else. It's not going to affect me. So by changing this to make it more personal for people, it can have a bigger impact on making people want to make the change and be on board. And again, the opportunity here, I think, showing people that this could be a win-win situation. We've wanted to make some major transformations in the energy sector for many years. People are talking about it. There's some transformation, but we didn't really have an opportunity. And here we have this opportunity. And although I'm not an economist, to add to that aspect, we can look back at history and see what happened after the Great Depression in the US. People had no money. How did they get the economy going? They basically developed this idea of mortgages, that if someone wants to buy their dream house today, they don't have the money. Let the banks give them a mortgage and they'll pay it off over the next 30 years, but they can live their dream today. We need to also think of some financial financial tools that we can actually get the population, countries invested in clean technology, in battery, in fuel cells running on hydrogen. Do it now to protect the future, but we'll pay for it in the future. Give people loans or mortgages and some kind of economic model which we can actually do this quickly.
So let me ask you both a follow-up question. Both of you have talked about the opportunities that lie in technology, both in terms of technologies that are already there and technologies that are getting developed in the laboratories. Professor Price, you're sitting in Tel Aviv University. You are leading two research centers in addition to your other scientific work. Mr. Godrej, you are very well versed on the developments of technologies in renewables and in energy storage, which you were referring to earlier. Here's the question. Under the kind of panic that we are facing with regards to the economic crisis that we are in, what new messages, what new tools are needed to get the technological cooperation to increase between countries, despite the economic crisis? What can India and Israel do together, for instance? Maybe Professor Price, you go first on this one.
Well, I'll start on the technology side of things. I think Israel has also leads the world in technology related to water. We recycle, say, 86% of all our sewage. In desalination, a lot of our drinking water is desalinated. And so it can be done. I think the next country following us is only 23% recycling of their sewage. So we need, instead of, now that we have the technologies for water, we need to move to technologies for energy. New technologies can be done. We have new materials coming out, new research. We need to invest heavily in innovative technologies, both top-down and bottom-up. Startup companies, let people think of new ideas. How are we going to actually tackle this problem? It seems like an impossible problem to move away from fossil fuels. And it is a huge problem, but it's also a huge challenge. And so we really have to think of both investing bottom up and top down in trying to solve this. we need leaderships. And here maybe Israel and India together somehow can provide some leadership in how we're going to do this. In Israel, maybe we're fairly strong with the startups and with the technologies, especially which we have the experience from water, which we can go into the energy sector. India is one of the biggest countries in the world and can show some good leadership as well. And so hopefully working together, we can combine the leadership and the science and the technology to make some change and show the way.
Mr. Godrej, in my opening remarks, I'd asked, whether between the rock and the hard place, there could be a valley with a gigafactory for batteries. What is your view on using the economic stimulus to also trigger technological innovation?
Yeah, Arunabha, I think, this crisis has also shown that there is a role for international cooperation in developing a vaccine or a cure or something for COVID-19 beyond what we know today. And labs are working all over the world. They are sharing information. Mm-hmm. In fact, the original, the nature of this COVID virus was even, was mapped in China and given to the world to work on. So I think, this has shown that it is possible, but it is happening because it's an immediate health threat, as Professor just mentioned. Right. So I think we also have to frame the climate issue and the growth issue in very similar ways and get that international cooperation to happen. I think people would adopt new technologies very quickly if they were easily available and I won't say affordable immediately. I think people do understand, that some of these things may have additional costs, but they have other benefits. So I think that maybe our communication in these things need to improve to frame it in a way that people can appreciate that, yes, there is a benefit to it. And this debate will always be there, short-term versus medium-term versus long-term benefits and costs. But, take battery technology as an example. You mentioned it. I think the world standard has been lithium-ion. The world has moved to lithium-ion for mobility, especially for mobility. But there are other solutions for solar backup and things like that. And this is really an area which can work on with international cooperation to develop new technologies, to develop new systems and bring the cost significantly down. And we all know that, how much all our countries have suffered by having very poor air quality. And so we need to get into these technologies to be able to change that position. My hope is really that we look at climate change in a way that will encourage more technology and innovation and actually result in things.
I think there's an interruption and yes, Mr. Godrej, we can hear. We just lost you for a few seconds.
I think, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I think we've lost power in the house here. So maybe a problem, but at least
exactly when you need the battery backup.
Yeah, I know. But the battery is there in the iPad, so it should carry on for a little while anyway.
Right. So let me turn to one more question and there are a number of questions that have started coming from the audience. I'm going to turn to those in a second. One of the downsides of this economic crisis that we're all in is that it is staggering in different timescales for different economies. So for instance, China shut down first, and now that it's opening up, other countries are still shut down. And say when Spain decides to open up, maybe India will still not be ready and so forth. With this crisis is coming an increasing tendency towards relying on your own, out of desperation. The Prime Minister articulated it 2 days ago as self-reliance. That does not mean you are exiting the global economy, but you have to rely a lot more on what you can get at home. So the conundrum then that poses us is, this is happening exactly at the time when we actually had an opportunity to lengthen the supply chains for clean energy technologies. You know, critical minerals from somewhere, the software for smart grids from somewhere, the hardware for batteries from somewhere, the panel development somewhere, the panel manufacturing somewhere. And if all countries move towards self-reliance because of an economic crisis, what does that do to the potential for more trade in clean technologies? Mr. Godrej, maybe you go first, and then I'll turn to Professor Price.
Yeah, I hope the audio will be clear because I've lost my Wi-Fi also now. Anyway,
We can hear you.
Okay. You know,
No,
You're on mute.
we can't
Oh,
hear
yeah.
you now. Can you hear us, Mr. Godrej?
yes.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think the most important thing to recognize is that value chains, you know, must be preserved. And
Right.
it is partly about self-sustaining what you can do, but it is also about value chains internationally. You know, I think we have to recognize that the advantage of value chains is that, you know, you not only improve trade, but you also bring the most value, you know, wherever it can be done the best. So it's very important for us. I think, for instance, look at semiconductors. You know, India doesn't really figure anywhere in semiconductors. Tomorrow, if you say that we should be only self-sufficient in semiconductors, is it really possible in a reasonable period of time? So I think we have to recognize what we can do and provide to others versus what others can do and provide to us. And I think the solar panel is an interesting point in here, is that, you know, there takes a huge amount of capital to develop the building blocks for a solar cell. But once that is done, you know, the whole world can be involved in, you know, adding value, building solar cells, doing innovation, doing things in a different way. So I think we must look where our benefit lies, how we can really contribute the most. And the interesting point here is take India's space program. Okay, I think, you know, I mean, you can argue about, you know, have every last rupee of that effort been accounted for or not. But despite all that, you know, our costs of putting, you know, satellites in space, our costs of doing telecommunication from space, I mean, it is really much, much lower, because I think we have developed a wonderful infrastructure, you know, of launch vehicles and satellites, etc. Now, it's not enough. We have to scale it up. So to scale it, what does it take? So those are the type of challenges I think we should look at. And how will India's capability in satellites benefit our region? Can the entire, you know, South Asian region or the Southeast Asian region benefit from India's leading position in satellites? So I think that's the way rather to look at it, rather than, you know, try to be self-sufficient in everything. We have, unfortunately, a history also on, you know, on being self-sufficient in everything. And that did result in much higher costs and substandard products, etc. Now that's behind us. So we don't want to go back to where that was, but certainly look at the benefits of doing things where we have value and strength.
Professor Price, Israel, you know, is an innovation hub, and yet, you know, how will you plug yourself into these shrinking supply chains? Because often your markets for Israeli technology is outside of Israel, and if
Exactly. We have a very
in, what's the opportunity there then?
We also have a very small market, but I agree. We have to have global cooperation here to solve, especially the climate problem. And the present crisis, Korona crisis, I think is going to have very small long-term effects. I think in another 10 years, the economy will have rebounded everywhere. We're not going to see any changes we'll be back on track, say, with greenhouse emissions, even population. I don't think we'll see any changes in the long term. But with the climate change, again, this is a long-term battle we have to deal with. And so we have to cooperate globally to find the solutions, whether it's the technologies or regulation or anything else. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Okay, so I think it's, thank you. We've had a great conversation so far. We've touched upon some of the key issues on technology, on finance, on carbon pricing, on manufacturing and trade. But now let me turn a little bit to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. I'm going to start with a couple of questions to you, Mr. Godrej. I'm just combining them in the interest of time. What do you think, one listener asks, what do you think will be the top 3 impacts of climate change in India? And what can India do to minimize it? But equally, when we listen to the Prime Minister's speech on self-reliant India, where do you think climate change fits in that kind of a narrative? Is there one, is it even top of mind of the policymakers?
Yeah, Arunabha, I think, the top 3 impacts that we've had really have to do with air and water and managing natural resources. And I think if we look at what has happened over the last 50 years, where we were and where we are now, we've had enormous improvement in development and incomes, especially in the middle class. I think that we have not carried, the poorer people with us as much as we should have, but certainly a large number have come out of poverty, but enormous numbers still remain. So I think if we don't focus, on environmental factors, which is air and water specifically, and our natural environment, I think even if you're doing mining, are you doing it in a sustainable way? If you're going to do, whatever you want to do, if you don't have a sustainable component in it, I think that definitely that is a problem. And what was the second question?
The second question was in the context of the Prime Minister's speech.
Yes.
India, where does climate change then fit in?
Yeah. Well, I didn't hear anything specific on it, but clearly there is a focus there on the medium and small industries that I think it's very important for us to recognize that many of our large companies, have done a lot in this area. They have internalized many of these issues and dealt with them, effectively. But this is an ongoing journey. It's never ends. But I think the challenge has always been with the small and medium industries in India. And they have really had the brunt of everything, in terms of development, in terms of the way that, they contribute in our economy. And to support them, is the right way in the stimulus package. But I think that we should have thought a little more about how we can support them in a sustainable way. So it would be interesting for us to work. I think one of the models that has worked the best so far is that people who are in the supply chain, they must work together, and whichever industry it is. And that works the best because there is a shared reliance on each other.
I think even from an economic point of view, Mr. Godrej, at CW, we had surveyed more than 400 MSMEs across 8 states. And one of the things we found was that the energy costs are one of the largest components of input costs for Indian MSMEs. And energy costs, as Indian industry knows, are already very high for Indian industry. So in fact, there is a double potential to actually reduce emissions, but also shift to cleaner energy, which might even be cheaper and improve one's competitiveness. Professor Price, let me turn a little bit towards another type of question that has come up on technology development. So on one hand, there is a big push towards transportation emissions reduction. And the way to do that is a move towards electric vehicles. India also has been promoting them for a few years now. But the question is about the life cycle kind of emissions, whether it's in the production process, whether it's the battery development, etc., but also, of course, the power source that will drive electric vehicle. So how do you push the transition of one sector while some of the other sectors might still be reliant on fossil energy? So if the electricity is still coming from fossil energy, what's the whole point at all of a move towards electric vehicles?
Well, I think you're correct. Also, the problem with the life cycle of batteries, lithium batteries, what we do with them at the end. So we need to really think in different directions for mobility, including sharing of transportation. And the car manufacturers actually build cars so that we'll replace them every few years, every 3, 4, 5 years. If we could actually share those cars and they would be around for 50 years and people were renting them and paying them, maybe the car industry would change the way they build cars and make them last for much longer. So we definitely need to change the way of our thinking of using mobility as a service. We have in Israel a company called Via, which is basically, it's kind of between taxis and between buses. And it's actually it's a great service where you can actually just through an application rent a ride and with 1 or 2 other people. And so we need to reduce also obviously the amount of cars on the road, and thinking again of how we can get people around. Obviously public transport is the best, but there are other ways we can do this. The technology, again, we need to think of storage in a different way maybe. I think instead of lithium batteries, we need to really focus more on fuel cells driven by hydrogen. Hydrogen we have in every water molecule. We need energy to produce that hydrogen, but we could eventually use solar to produce the hydrogen, and we could then store the solar energy during the night. We don't know what technologies we'll have in 10 years. Nobody would have dreamt of having these smartphones in our pockets 10, 20 years ago, which basically we at the world at our fingertips, and a computer in our pocket, which is much stronger than any computer we had 20 years ago. Right. That's probably, we don't know where we'll be in 10 years, but if we don't look for these solutions, we're not going to get there.
Mr. Godrej, could you reflect on another question that has come in? Given that now renewables, particularly solar, is turning out to be, even with batteries, it's turning out to be cheaper than fossil power. For instance, just 2-3 months ago, India had the largest bid of 1,200 megawatts of solar plus storage for round-the-clock supply, which was one of the world's lowest tariffs and was beating fossil-based energy as well. Is it time for India also to consider a new Green Deal, as is being discussed in the United States? And would it create more jobs? Would it be economically workable under the current economic situation we are in?
No, actually, that's a very good idea, Arunabha, to think of what a new Green Deal for India could be about and how will it create more jobs. Of course, you have to look at net jobs also, because you may lose some jobs, say in coal mining, but you will make up in many other clean technologies. I think that, this new Green Deal I think that one of the problems that I have found when talking to friends and, associates, etc., about air pollution, say, for instance, and why is it that people only think about air pollution when the air pollution is at its peak. You have also written a lot about that. And I think that unless you can keep something, on people's mind all the time, as on these type of issues, it becomes very difficult for people to internalize. I think Professor also talked about this issue. Today, everybody's, focused on COVID and finding a solution. Okay. If it goes away and when it goes away, it's like the flu, for instance. We take the flu as something that's given, it's there. And yes, of course, it does kill people, but it's there and it's sort of internalized and people have accepted. I think we need to think about what we need to do from that point of view here. We should not also forget that when we talk of green energy, despite it being controversial, nuclear power is a very good option for India. We have very, very small percentage of the overall power mix in nuclear, and there is room to not just double it, but treble it. And, so as the demand for power grows, I think we should also look at the mix of items. It cannot rely solely on solar with battery or on wind or on nuclear. I think the mix is important, and different regions of the country will have different needs for different mixes based on where they are. We know that wind is much stronger in the monsoon, and the western coast of India and the very south of India, does have a huge wind potential. Right. So regional differences will make a difference. But I think one point to remember is that there will have to be some renewal, which means that you have to retire something in right. order to promote something else also. Right. You can't say that I'm never going to retire the oldest coal-fired power plants, because that's it would be a national waste. Right. You have to bite that bullet and say, yes, these are very old, they are very inefficient, they are not good from a pollution point of view, and they must be retired. And at the same time, we have to build new and build it sustainably, whatever it is, whether it's solar or nuclear or wind. And I like the point that Professor made on the hydrogen economy. Yeah. I think not enough has been thought about on the hydrogen economy, and we certainly need to think much more on that.
There's that famous quip of, the world did not come out of the Stone Age because the world ran out of stones. We moved to other technological options. But precisely on this point on hydrogen, Mr. Godrej earlier, Professor Price, Mr. Godrej earlier had said the climate action is not just limited to power sector decarbonization. You've also talked about hydrogen at CW. We've been working extensively on the applications of green hydrogen for heavy industries, steel, petrochemicals, fertilizers, and so forth. So from a technology point of view, could you reflect a little bit more on what will be needed to take hydrogen or green hydrogen out of the laboratory, out of pilot projects, into a much larger kind of level of application, whether it's in long distance transport or in heavy industries?
Well, I'm not an expert really in hydrogen fuel, so I don't know if I can really, if I want to go into this area that much, but I'd also just like to agree that I also think, although most people are against nuclear, I think we shouldn't throw out nuclear. Nuclear, although it may be even a lot more expensive than renewable energies to build any new plants, it's definitely the area needed for them is much less than solar plants. And the technology is available today, so we can use it with all the problems with nuclear waste. There's no perfect solution. Nothing is black and white in the world. There's a lot of shades of gray, and we have to look at what's the pros and cons. The same with the batteries. Also with the hydrogen economy, it's problematic at the moment. We need a fair amount of energy to produce that hydrogen. To scale up to, on a global scale, even a national scale, may be extremely difficult. But it's a challenge. We need to think how to solve these challenges. I don't think that if we keep on going down the same road, we're going to solve the problem. We're just going to delay the problem. So if we just reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, as the Paris 215 agreement, it's just basically giving us time to find solutions. But eventually we have to transform the whole economy of the world away from fossil fuels. And this is going to take time, innovation. We don't know how we're going to get there, but we got to do it.
Well, and that's the conundrum. And to use the pandemic language, we're not flattening the curve. We are only pushing the curve out. So an economic recession today will only result in greenhouse gas emissions rising in future. What we need to do is bend the curve and flatten it and take it in negative territory, which brings me back as the kind of final. We are in the last 5 minutes of this conversation. I think one of the listeners has also asked a very important question linked to something both of you have stressed. the importance of governance and leadership. So we've talked about finance, we've talked about technology, we've talked about the opportunity in jobs, we've talked about trade and supply chains. But now, knowing all of this and knowing how we have responded to the pandemic, what do you think is likely to change in terms of governance and leadership towards climate action? Do you think we will imbibe any lessons? And what do you think needs to change even more? Maybe even at starting from an individual level. How do we create a democratic demand for faster action on climate change? Maybe Professor Price, I'll turn to you first and then move to Mr. Godrej for his final comments.
Okay. Well, I think, again, I think that this present crisis has shown us that it can be done, that we can come together, the leaders of the world can decide to shut down their countries for the good of their own people. They can make very tough decisions which are impacting the economies. Whether they'll do the same for climate change, that's a big question. Hopefully they will, but I'm a little more pessimistic there. We need leadership, but we also need to obviously convince them that there's a problem here, and maybe making it more personal also to the leaders, showing them that this is also related to the health issues of the population, and also showing them the economic, the bill that they're going to get at the end if they don't do anything. Hopefully we can influence the leaders of our countries and of the world to actually start to do something. I think that's part of the role that this webinar today is. We need to talk about this. We need to spread the word. We need to get the public aware of it and the leaders aware of it. Otherwise, nothing will happen. So we're actually doing part of that role, but we're just one little dot on the map. We need to really spread the word, get it to our leaders to convince them that this is a bigger crisis than the one we're going through. And if they manage to shut down their countries for Corona, they should be able to change the economy and better health for the public in the future.
Mr. Godrej, if the leaders still don't act, what do we do as individuals?
You know, I think one of our problems globally is that we don't hold our leaders to account on climate. I think the movement has been, a very restricted movement in the sense that there are a few people who are very agitated about it, but I think it's not the general public who is agitated about it. And part of this is, I think, to do with the way we communicate. I think we have to also learn what is the right way to communicate the issues that we've been talking about to a much wider population. I think English is not necessarily the language that we're going to be able to use to communicate this to a much wider group of people in India, for instance, you see. Right. So I think we must learn this. The second thing is that I think that we have to go on talking about transparency. I think that one of the problems, in any country is the lack of transparency and the lack of information. And this has to be, addressed. And very often, I think those in power treat it as a threat to themselves. But I think we should frame it also in a way that it is not a threat. This is really a matter of governance. It's really a matter of, where tax money is being spent, how it's being spent, where is the wasteful expenditure in it. That debate must be accepted as an open debate and a debate that will result in the greater good for everybody. I think this is part of our mission that is required. I think if you ask me, I think we do it, but we don't do enough of it. And we have failed in bringing common people on the platform of saying, yes, that we must, concentrate our mind on how we are going to keep the country from going, what has happened in COVID has happened. Okay, can it happen through climate change? Yes, of course it can. We all know that. But because, as Professor was saying, it's a slow process, you're reminded of that story of the frog being boiled. Right. So I think this is part of the problem, and we must improve our communication, our way of being able to frame the questions and frame it in a way that it is good for everybody. And why is it good for everybody needs to be clearly understood.
Well, we are out of time. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much to Mr. Godrej and Professor Colin Price for illuminating us with both the tools that we have at our disposal, whether it's on the finance side, on the technology side, but also the mechanisms we need on the political and the governance side to generate more action. The conundrum, of course, is not an easy one to solve. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But just to pick up on what Mr. Godrej was closing with, this issue of transparency and communication, I think that has to be the pillar on which any kind of conversation around sustainability stands. If we don't know how much we are emitting, if we don't know how much what our personal footprint is, we will not get nudged to make a change in our own behavior. If countries don't know how they are managing or mismanaging their ecosystems, their water resources, their forests, etc., they will not know what they're losing out on in terms of even economic growth potential. If we don't count how many jobs are there in renewables as opposed to the fossil energy sector, we won't see the opportunities for our children to have very different types of careers. And it is for this reason that I have been arguing for some time that we need to try and square this potential impossible trinity of jobs, growth, and sustainability. And when we look at public policy, it tends to promote usually two out of these three, sometimes jobs and growth, sometimes growth and sustainability for large projects of renewables, for getting the job side. And once we begin to be transparent and communicate the opportunity on all three grounds, I think we have a new opportunity opening up despite the crisis we are in, or the crises we are in. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us on Zoom and on Facebook Live. Thank you, Mr. Godrej. Thank you, Professor Price. And,
thank you.
And we look forward to having you at the next session on Between a Rock and a Hard Place.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good day to all of you.